Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric. I got a fun and random episode for you guys this Friday because about a month ago I had a few too many drinks in me and I decided to grab my phone and look at eBay while drinking. And every time I seem to do that, I purchase something that I didn't need, probably don't want, and is going to give me an absolute massive headache to get running. And today is no different. We have a Konami Hornet that was sold to me as a silent scope. It was not sold by an arcade vendor, it was sold by a reseller that buys warehouses. And when I saw the photos of this, it looked pretty much new old stock, so I figured why not give it a go. And while this is a silent scope board, I have silent scope 2 footage in my archive, so that's what I'm showing you here, but this board will run either silent scope or the sequel, and if I do keep this as a silent scope, it's definitely going to end up as silent scope 2 because that is my preferred game out of the two. But just taking a look at the unit itself, this is an absolute massive metal box of arcade glory. The Konami Hornet came out in 1997 and it had some revisions through to 2000, and the revisions are going to be maybe an issue for this project in and of itself. But you get a massive box, a huge filter board, and not one, not two, but 3 PCBs on the inside, which we will get to shortly. But when I did see the photos of this, I thought it had never been used, and if it has been used, it's been used extremely lightly. Normally on something like this that was used a long time in arcades, you're going to see an absolute metric ton of grime. Even on stickers here, you can't really wipe away all of the years of abuse. They're usually scratched, they're ripped up, or they're definitely stained with something. Here, not so much. Now I haven't powered this on yet because I do not have the connectors in stock. Those are on order, and this is something to see if you guys want to see a part 2 of this project, because they do take me a long time. But you have a close to JVS standard as far as the power input is concerned, with a VGA port out and stereo as well. So it's very similar to something like a Naomi, but it is not adhering exactly to the JVS standard, which means I need to make a conversion harness. We've got a lot of different connectors up here, option, digital 1-player and 2-player in, as well as some analog ports that are not actually populated at this point in time, because depending on the game, they would sub out the ports on the filter board to utilize them, and some of the filter caps, if you do want to convert these things, you do need to add them on secondarily, or else you're not going to have that signal filtered and it probably will not read. Other thing is, on the right hand side here is a 2-digit counter. This will give you all of the error codes if you have any, but unfortunately so many of those error codes are lost to time. They were probably useful at one point in time, but not so much now. We also have a bank of dip switches, and if you ever need to know what those do and you don't have a manual or it's not in the manual, just look in MAME, go into the tab menu, and you'll find all the dip switch settings for any game that emulates in there. The only other evidence that this was not a brand new board is that there's a slight dent in this little metal tab back here. Normally you'd put screws through those holes into the arcade cabinet, so if you moved it, the PCB wouldn't just start flying around, but this thing is a big beefy metal box, so I wasn't really worried about any damage inside. That seems to be just maybe a storage issue. But I took all the screws out just to save a little bit of time here, but we have to get into the top part of this. It's not too hard, you just kind of slide it up and back a little bit. It's definitely been a lot easier to get into this than some other Konami arcade PCBs I have, like the Baby Phoenix. That thing is basically a steel trap of problems and cutting knuckles. And there we are, we're into the top onto this CPU board, and you will see here this is the first layer of 3, and it kind of has a very PC design because this is kind of like a hybrid PC and arcade board at the same time. It's always fun to take a look at what people are doing with hardware, and it seems like I've already gotten my dog's hair into the arcade board. It was cleaner when I opened it, and then I managed to get all that hair in there. It just happens in my house, nothing you can do with a corgi. But taking a look here, it uses a PowerPC 403GA, which is not a very powerful processor, but it gets the job done. A little tiny bit of dust, but otherwise the board is still looking nice and fresh. And you'll see here we also have a Motorola 68000 that's going to handle some of the sound, and some EEPROMs that have been basically windowed off. This is some of the program ROM written towards the end. You're going to have some mask ROM chips, and you're also going to have some programmable ones, and you're going to have a lot of open slots depending on what game this board is going to be using. So these can be converted. You can burn new ROMs, pop them on, and make it pretty much any game you want, so long as the video board underneath is the one that I need. That is the big variable here. There's 2 revisions, one does great things and one doesn't do much whatsoever. And to see after that Motorola 68000, there are these jumpers here. If you switch the size of the ROMs anywhere on the board, you need to change the jumpers around to see if they're 64 megabit or 32 megabit. If you don't do this, it's not going to be able to pull high-low into those banks, and you're going to end up with a game that's not reading the data. Not many people really realize that, but it's part of the conversion process. And when I bought this board, my plan was to have this be a Gradius 4 dedicated board, but to do that I need a very specific video board underneath the CPU board, because Silent Scope released in 2 revisions, one with a Voodoo and one with a Voodoo 2 chipset underneath. Gradius 4 is only going to work on the Voodoo, so I need to disconnect all of these diverse cables take off the standoff screws and get underneath to see the second layer. But first, let's take a little look at the sound section here. You're going to see that it is isolated, and that's pretty standard for soundboards, and you're going to have stereo out. Looks like there's a connection for a subwoofer there as well that's not connected, and of course we have the dreaded Konami RTC real-time clock chip that is lithium battery backed. These things love to die all the time, so much so that if you go into MAME and try to run Gradius 4 right now, you're going to get an RTC checksum error, and then you can reset it using the test key. On real hardware, all you do is pop a blank chip in there, it's going to read the same thing, and you can reprogram the chip on the fly. This is easier than some Konami boards, but pretty much all the boards from the 90s for Konami are going to have these clock chips on, and they're going to present either a minor problem or a massive problem depending on what board you're dealing with, and depending on whether or not that battery is already dead. But you can reset it in MAME, which means we can reset it in real world if we so have to. But we'll take some of these cables out here. They're pretty much all press fit, but anytime you're doing this, you want to be careful and make sure you're not ripping too hard. I'm going to do the rest of it off camera because it is hard for me to do this over the shoulder of the tripod, and through the magic of editing, we're going to get there very quickly, just like this. But I do demarcate what goes where. In this instance, all of the cables are basically the same, so probably not essential. You have your different voltages and grounds there demarcated with the colors, but anytime you're unhooking anything, give yourself a little bit of a legend. But you'll see all of these different cables have been disconnected now, and we need to find out where the press fit connectors are. Anytime you see a big bank of solder joints there, just put your finger in and see if you feel any connectors. There's nothing here or there, but right here is the connector between the CPU board and the first video board. So just get your fingers in there and gently wiggle it loose. If it's not coming loose, don't continue to apply more pressure. You're going to have a bad time. You're probably going to break something. But with that, we've got the CPU board loose. We can go check the video board to see if it's what we need. But it's certainly a pretty board. We just need to find out if it's actually going to function for the intent of the reason I bought it in the first place. We need a 713 video board, and we ended up with an 871. This is a Voodoo 2 board. The code for Gradius 4 is not going to function on this. You can burn ROMs all day long. It's just not going to have the code to understand how to talk to the Voodoo 2. So this is basically going to end up being a dedicated Silent Scope or Silent Scope 2 board. So there go my dreams from converting this to Gradius 4 and having a conversion but still dedicated piece of hardware to play this game. I absolutely love it. I've emulated on MAME. I have it on other platforms, but I really wanted original Konami Hornet to be able to play this. But when you buy from somebody who's not an arcade collector, they're just a warehouse reseller, you're not going to be able to ask them to open up all of the PCBs to check for you, and the only way to find out is to go underneath the CPU layer. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. You've got some mask ROMs for all of the graphical data. You've got a Konami Custom and that press fit connector that we just removed on the CPU board. And you also have a DSP or digital signal processor chip here, as well as another Konami Custom and a very small FPGA chip. Seems like I can't get away from FPGA even when I'm talking about arcade boards from the 90s. And you'll see here that it has not one but two VGA ports. The top one is going to go out to the front of the board, and that's what's going to drive the main monitor, and that's going to be a 24 kilohertz medium resolution format. But because this is an XY coordinate game and not a light gun game, that means it doesn't really matter as far as the functionality of the light gun would be concerned. And the bottom VGA port is going to go directly to the scope because this is a dual screen game. The second screen is just a little tiny screen in a rifle scope on your arcade cabinet, which obviously I don't have that gigantic control for, so that's kind of what I'm questioning what I'm going to do with this thing. It may have the right CPU board, they all do, but the video board's never going to be a Gradius 4, so now I need to decide what to do with it. Do I try to modify in custom controls with the second screen? Do I try to find the scope? You guys let me know down below what you want to see because I would be curious. And my idea that this was new old stock, definitely not true once I finally got around the corner here. There's very light dust around the timekeeper where the fan comes in. Still one of the most pristine boards I've ever received, and it was probably not used much whatsoever, but the fan has definitely ingested some dust on this side, so it's not new old stock. If I take a look at that timekeeper battery as well, and I look at the solder joints underneath, I'm trying to see whether or not it's ever been worked on, because it's definitely not socketed, and they didn't come socketed from the battery. But after removing a little bit of the dust, these are all machine joints right here. So this battery is probably fully dead. I'm probably at the minimum going to have to take this real-time clock chip off, socket it, and put a blank one on there and rewrite it for future use. Never a fun job, but pretty much always something you need to do with Konami. So let's put this thing back together and just kind of talk about what it is that we want to do with it. There's a couple different options. We can leave it as an original Silent Scope, or we can convert it to Silent Scope 2. I could try to acquire the original controls and mount some sort of box and have that be basically a full cabinet outside of the cabinet in and of itself. Or I could just sell this thing to somebody who wants a working Silent Scope board, knowing that it's very pristine inside, and try to at least get my money back. That's what happens when you have to take a chance on arcade boards sometimes. Sometimes you win and you hit a home run, other times you strike out completely. This one's not so much a strikeout, it's basically like the ball hit me in the back of the head. Definitely feel like maybe I should have left my phone at home and not used it when I was drinking. But the whole thing's put back together so we can talk a little bit more about how I could do this. You'll see here that I did get the manual with it. It was bought November 1999, and it's even got the license number and the model number, so I figured this isn't a precious thing. I will say that it's added to my collection on November of 23. That way at least I know when I got the thing, and when it moves on, maybe somebody else will write on it. I do this sometimes, it's my stuff, doesn't really too much matter. If we take a look through here, you get all of the different options on the game, but the most important thing is going to be the wiring diagram in the back. Now this game works on XY coordinates as far as the up and down, left and right of the scope is concerned. So that's basically something I've converted a bunch. The video signal, the power is all very easy. It's the secondary screen for the scope I'm not sure what to do. I could try to find a small screen that could take 15 kilohertz signals in and try to mount that on top of a flight stick. It might be a little goofy, but it might be kind of funny. But honestly, Silent Scope is a great franchise, and I knew that if I got this board and it didn't have the right video connectors, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, and odds are I'm probably going to keep this thing, but you tell me down below what you want to see. But that's the Konami Hornet. It's a Silent Scope board, and I even got the gigantic marquee. But be careful, kids, don't grab your phone and go on eBay when you've been drinking. Bad things happen. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.